residential versus commercial property management. Okay guys, we are talking about commercial versus residential property management. What's the differences? What are things you need to be aware of? How does that happen differently if it's commercial versus residential? Great question. If you've got a question like this, type it in the comments below and I'll create a video just like this for you and all my other amazing subscribers. Thank you for being a subscriber for those that are. Okay guys, so here's the deal. Commercial property, there's a lot of aspects of commercial property, right? So for commercial property, you've got apartments. You also have office space. You have industrial, you have warehouses. So when it's dealing with commercial, there's lots of different venues when it comes to commercial. But in residential property, you're typically dealing with a single family house, a duplex, threeplex, or a fourplex. That's going to be considered residential side of it, where commercial is going to be considered basically everything else. And so what we're talking about here is what is the differences in management. And one of the big differences is with a lot of commercial properties, you can write your contracts to be what are called triple net leases. Net, which basically means that the amount that you're advertising is coming to you as the landlord, and the tenant is responsible for everything else. The tenant's responsible for paying the taxes, the tenant's responsible for paying the insurance, the tenant's responsible for paying the upkeep, the landscape, the tenant's responsible for doing everything on the property. If there's a leaky roof, if there's a faucet that has a problem, all that type of stuff, the tenant is responsible for paying all of that, not the landlord. And that's why it's called a triple net lease. The other type of leases you have are what are called full service leases. And a full service lease is where the landlord is responsible for paying for everything. The landlord's paying for everything. In some cases, the landlord is also paying for janitorial work on the property. Then there's also this thing called a modified triple net lease, which basically means, hey, we'll pay for everything, but we're not going to pay for your janitorial, and we're not going to pay for, janitorial is typically a thing in a modified triple net lease that's being excluded. With both of those, and typically in a full service lease, the landlord's not paying for the internet and not paying for the phones. But in a full service lease, the landlord is paying for the gas, paying for the electric, paying for the water, sewer, garbage, paying for the trash pickup. All those things are being paid by the landlord in a full service lease. The big difference here is typically when you're dealing with a commercial property, you're signing a lease for 5 years. The other thing, 3 to 5 years, but typically 5 years. And what you're doing is you're getting financials from the company to make sure that company is going to be able to last well in that property for a long period of time. Now, this is when we're dealing with office space. This is not when we're dealing with apartments. Apartments, they're managed differently, but they're still considered commercial. So with your office space and those things, you've got this idea of triple net lease or full service lease. A lot of people like triple net lease because they never get a phone call. If they put on a good tenant and the tenant has good financials and it's a triple net lease, they're going to have that property. They're going to be there for 5 years. The landlord never gets a phone call because the tenant is responsible for paying for anything that happens to the property. And so that makes it a lot easier in being a landlord because you're like, I don't have to deal with any of this stuff. And that's a great thing for landlords if they're doing that. Now, let's just talk about this in an apartment complex. Typically in an apartment complex, you want to get an apartment complex to the size where you can have what's called on-site management. And the reason with on-site management is basically somebody lives on the property. They're living there. Lots of times there'll be an on-site handyman that lives in the property, and usually he'll get free rent in association for him living there, and then he does a bunch of repairs. Maybe it's an older, semi-retired guy that's kind of a handyman that helps with that type of stuff. That's the thing you're dealing with apartment complexes. You're dealing with a lot of, there's usually always something broken. There's usually always somebody that's vacancy, so you're always trying to put somebody into the property. Those types of things are happening on a very regular basis, and it's always turnover. Now, if you go to the residential side, it depends. So on the residential side, if you're dealing with a duplex, a threeplex, or a fourplex, those tend to be more transient, meaning people aren't staying there for a very long time. It's more they come, they're there for 6 months, they're there for a year, they're leaving. You're dealing with that a lot with apartment complexes. Now, by the way, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that thumbs up button. It tells me I'm doing a great job, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. I'm just saying. So, but with this, We're talking about apartment complexes and plexes in general, where you're dealing with more of a transient type person that's not going to be there as long. Maybe they're going to college, maybe they're going to school, maybe they're they're newlyweds, whatever the case is. But you're dealing with, and that's usually just because of the size of the place. They're usually 1 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms. Very rarely are you dealing with a 3-bedroom type stuff. My favorite, this is my personal favorite, it's also the one that pays the least, but it's the least amount of hassle, and that's a single family houses. I prefer single family houses because with single family houses, I can get a longer term tenant. I always sign people up for a year, but my average tenant stays about 5 years because I like to be under the rent. So if market rents are $1,000, I'll rent for $950. That way I can find the very best tenant that's out there. I get the pick of the litter. I look at it as a job interview and hire the best person to take care of the property. And then they stay longer because I'm always a little bit under rent. And with the size of my houses that are typically 4 beds, 2 bathrooms, I like to have a 2-car garage or 2-car carport. They stay longer. So my average tenant stays a long time. So it's kind of the mix between the advantages of some of the commercial properties, but in a residential type property. So, but when it comes down to management of these things, you've got your commercial property that's your office, industrial, those things that your triple net, your full service, or your modified full service leases. You've got that's kind of on its own bucket. Then you've got the apartment complexes that are where people are living. So they're kind of like you're dealing with some of the residential stuff. However, you're always dealing with tenants, and you're always dealing with toilets. There's always something broken. You're always trying to keep occupancy, and that's really what it comes down to with these bigger apartment complexes is occupancy. How many people are in there? How much of the property is occupied? Because if you don't meet a minimum occupancy rate, you're losing money each month when it comes to that apartment complex. So the deal is you've got to keep that occupied to a certain level, or else you're in the red all the time. Now, the nice thing about some of these plexes, and maybe even about the apartment complex, is you're not all or nothing. So when I deal with a single family house, I either have rent or I don't have rent. It's not offsetting. Whereas if I have a 3-plex or a 4-plex, I could have 3 of them rented and 1 of them vacant, and I'm getting some of my money, just not all of my money. Whereas if it's a single family house and somebody's not in there, I'm getting nothing. So some people like that. Now, I started out in doing the 3-plex, 4-plexes, duplexes, and that type of stuff, and it typically is more profitable, but it's also more hands-on. You've got more tenants, you've got more toilets, you've got more maintenance, and so you're typically dealing with more stuff. I got a better return, however, I was putting in a lot more effort, and so for myself, I said, hey, I would rather make a little less return and get a better return on my time by not having to have as many units and as many toilets and as many bedrooms and that type of stuff that I'm continually having to keep updated, which is where I transferred over to single family houses, did some 1031 exchange, got out of some of the plexes. Now, there's not a right or wrong strategy here, and that's why real estate is so amazing. There's lots of ways to skin the cat and get what you want out of that. Like if you're just gunning for cash flow and that's what you need, the plexes are probably a good idea, but just be aware they're high management intense, and you've got to be prepared for that. And if that's what you want, because you need that higher return, it can be a great place to start. You can go for that. But if you don't want to deal with some of those headaches, then you could look more on the single family houses. Now, one of the detriments with any of the commercial properties is the amount of money that's required to put down. You typically have to put 20% down. And a lot of these apartment deals, they do what's called syndication, where the sponsor finds the deal or works with somebody that finds the deal, and then they go get a loan for 80%, and then they give minority ownership to people that bring in the 20%, and then they become partners in that, but they don't take on much liability or anything else. So that's what we're talking about here, is we're talking about residential versus commercial property management. With the apartments, it's pretty similar to what you're doing with residential anyway. It's just a bigger scale with more people, and there's always something going on with that. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. If so, hit that thumbs up button. I would really appreciate it. Also, if you want to send me over a text, I will give you a copy of my rental property calculator. All you got to do is text 435-294-0433, 435-294-0433. You get a copy of my rental calculator. This will help you know what's a good rental, what's not a good rental, and it calculates that for you so you can help evaluate which properties make sense to be considering as rentals and which ones don't. I also have a video on how to evaluate potential rental properties, which I'll put on the screen and link in the notes, as well as a blog article on how do I find good rental properties. If you're looking for that, check it out. Otherwise, make it a very profitable day, and bye for now.